Okay, now you're live on Facebook.
Okay, how long do we have?
So
Until 5:30 was the schedule?
Yeah, that was the schedule.
Great.
If you want, you can still make it 1 hour and a half.
Ah, that's fine. Ready? Okay, thank you everyone. What I'm going to talk about today is about democracy, populism, the left, and ways of using these concepts and understanding these concepts, particularly when it comes to debating, which obviously does differ from how you would use it in an academic context, but hell, that's just the nature of debating in general, and part of it is how exactly you can express some very complex phenomenon in fairly simple ways and in ways which end up sounding intuitive. I think one of the things no one ever tells you about debating, but it's worth starting with, is the ideal is to say something very simple in a way which makes it sound like you are explaining a complex idea in a simple way. But what you really do want to be doing is thinking about what those simple ideas are and how you express them in a way which actually sounds quite compelling. So I want to start by asking the most basic question. Why do we find democracy to be valuable? What are your answers? Or if you had to prove that in debate, why should we care? Or why should we value this principle or this reality of democracy? What would your answers be?
because we tried to develop something else, something better for the last 5,000 years and we failed, so it's the best of the worst.
Okay, so the Winston Churchill idea, there isn't anything we have which is better. Maybe, but that doesn't seem to be the most compelling justification for the merits of democracy, but certainly one which, maybe on a practical level, does seem to be the one people use. But let's go into that. What is it which makes it better than the other systems? Yeah.
Mostly the control part, that we can't actually, like authoritarian regimes, etc., are not accountable for most of what they do.
Mm-hmm.
While in democracies we elect the representatives that do the governing work, and since we elect them, they have to answer to us in order to get re-elected.
Yeah. So one reason, or to explain that in a slightly higher way, and that's one of the concepts behind it, is there's an instrumental value of democracy. That democracy is likely to produce better results than other forms of government. And one of the reasons for that is because you have a mechanism of accountability. That if the representative doesn't work in a way which maximizes or at least has a positive impact on the majority of the population, they are likely to be replaced. So that's certainly one form of justification, and there's many ways in which you can create this. You could say, look, if we talk about the kinds of decisions democracies will make, you have to care about what people think. You're more likely to pick people who represent the majority of the population rather than small sectarian interests. And for all those reasons, you're more likely, on an instrumental level, to get better outcomes as a result of democracy. And that's a theory. So we care about democracy because it produces better results. Is that the only reason we care about democracy? Maybe the answer is yes, but could you come up with other reasons why you might want to care about democracy? Yeah.
Okay. Firstly, for example, because you usually elect the people who legislate, so that means you can be one of those persons who actually decide what the laws which will be passed, what are they going to be about, which couldn't be done in forms which are not democratic. The second one is the same with executives, so you would usually elect the executive key body to be president or etc. So that means you can be sure that you have at least a chance in a vote in those cases when the person who is going to execute everything. Then also you have the opportunity of choices, because democracy implies that there is multi-party, so that means there are different ideas competing and you can share your ideas with one party or another and give one vote to either side, which you couldn't do in an autocratic country. And then lastly, you have a peaceful transition of power. That means if one country if a party loses, that means there's going to be a peaceful transition of power of the other party, which might be possible in an autocratic country, where there have been cases in Malaysia where the ruling party lost, but then they suddenly declared it a case of emergency and then still continued on ruling, which was a disaster because it showed that it was not essentially democracy. So following these principles, well, it just offers you a peaceful way of knowing that the ideas are actually the ones which are supported by the majority of people in the country.
Okay, so to separate that out, and albeit to simplify it in some ways, you have benefits in terms of believing and knowing there's likely to be a orderly transition of government, which I think is a instrumental justification. Democracy is good because it allows you to have new ideas emerge and changes in government without a mass rupture of the system. Indeed, changes in government are to some degree a feature of a democratic system. The second seems to be an idea about influence, that it is important that people are able to influence the decisions and rules they live under. That's obviously phrased slightly differently, but I do think it's what you're getting at when you look at the fact that we get to vote in our representatives, that there are multiple different ideas competing. Well, all that's important because we, as individuals, have some choice over the rules which govern us. But why does that matter? But continue, yeah.
It's self-recurring,
Mhm.
because there are so many changes, so if something doesn't work, it doesn't work with the machine that can do it replace.
Yeah. So I think that again gives you a good instrumental justification, which is why do we get better policy? Partly accountability, partly when you end up with negative policies, you are more likely to end up with a reaction to it, and as a result changes. So you would hope that despite potentially some hiccups within this process, that you would have an evolution to a better set of policies in the medium or in the long term. But maybe explore this other idea more, which is not that just democracy is good because it produces good outcomes, but maybe there is something important in the fact we're able to choose our government. And I think the reason why this question matters is we can certainly imagine many systems of government which in some cases could be better than a democracy. People can give the example of Singapore, quasi-democratic, but very much still controlled by a small elite, and is going to be a one-party government. But one you could definitely argue was produced for years better results for the population than you would have got through a normal, chaotic, democratic system. If you want to look at the history of development since the World War II, one of the features which people often comment on is the most successful developmental model is more often than not a one-party democracy, i.e. one where you do have some trappings of democratic institutions, but nonetheless you have one party which, absent an absolute crisis, is likely to win year after year after year, and statistically that seems to be the most effective form of governance, particularly in countries which are developing or want to develop. So if our justification of democracy is purely it produces better results, and albeit there are lots of reasons for that, you can certainly come up with counter-arguments as to why maybe we shouldn't value democracy at all. So is there another reason why we should value democracy beyond the fact it produces good results? We kind of get an idea of choice, but what else could there be? Yeah.
Is the sovereignty and the freedom of the people,
Mm-hmm.
so that there is, in the theory at least, no oppression, because as there was in the European monarchies at
Mhm.
least, so that, well, if the major people is against something, then they can act on it, so they have more freedom, so basically that.
Okay. So this is definitely an argument people present. So it's about the sovereignty of the people. But why exactly is that value? What is important about people being sovereign or being able to make decisions?
They're happier because, maybe not happier, but they're more satisfied, I would guess,
Mhm.
because they feel more responsible for their lives and country in general.
So you could definitely phrase that way. It almost seems like this placebo, which is democracy is nice because people feel like they're participating, and even if they're not, they feel fine. And I think there's almost certainly some truth in that, given the way democratic systems really tend to operate. But it almost just seems like there should be more in the idea that we're able to vote for our government and there's something we should care about. There just seems that there should be more to it than just it's something which makes us feel nice. But it's actually really difficult to articulate what that is. I think this is something which is particularly important when you think about this in debating. It's important political theory too, that no one's ever particularly good at articulating that non-instrumental justification for democracy. I think one of the reasons is if we're going to look for a non-instrumental justification, so one which says democracy is valuable almost irrespective of the result and whether it leads to a better outcome or not, the kind of justification we would come up with is it's important that you as an individual have influence over the rules which govern you. This is the state which literally will impact the way in which you live, what you are able to do and what you're unable to do. It's going to impact the kind of person your children and your other members of your family will become, the education system it is based on. In the end, any form of governance is just going to be a handful of individuals using the threat of force to tell you what you can and cannot do. And if we're going to believe that is any different than an armed group of thugs doing the same thing, it presumably has to do with the fact that we as a people are the ones choosing it. The difficulty there, though, is even when you start with that kind of justification, which may sound a little bit more compelling, it's a legitimization of what our government does to us, it's still that I don't have influence over my government. Just on a statistical level, my vote or anyone's vote in this room is almost certainly going to be irrelevant. We don't really choose the government we live under. We are subjects, even in the most perfect democratic system, to what the majority want. So it certainly isn't about individual agency and individuals' actual ability to choose the government they live under. It's about the ability of this collective called the people and their ability to make that choice. But yeah.
Well, considering that individual agency is like non-existent on a totalitarian system, like what? If not non-existent, then at least less than under a democratic system, that still falls under the category of like democracy being the least evil thing.
So I guess we have to look at that in more detail, which is let's say you have no agency under a totalitarian system. Let's agree on that. How much agency do you have to change policy in a democratic system? Now, obviously, there are going to be some individuals who have that power, but it's also true about a totalitarian system. Your claim is, through a voting process and the freedoms democracy give you, you have more than trivial amounts of agency. But I'm not even sure that that's an easy argument to make, because in a population with 20 million people, where what you really care about is whether policy benefits you or not, how likely are you going to be that pivotal voter for whether your party gets one more MP or not? Low. How likely is that MP going to be the one who changes policy or not? Even lower. And I think if you start magnifying that, it might be true you have more agency, but that might be 0.001 versus 0. And at some level, it might sound compelling, but I think once you actually think about how that operates, there seems to be something missing with that as an explanation. But yeah.
I think that, well, with the people, the power of the people is that it actually makes the communities, the society, like individuals in the community more proactive, so that it actually helps on the smaller scale than just the 20 million that almost have no impact. That, well, if people are in democracy, then every representative in a democratic system comes from a small place, so that they have to go through some steps to get the power. And so they have to start at the base of the community, so they first work in the community. So if they are the ones who go through, that there have to be more people in the community that are proactive also, so that one can separate from them and go further.
So I think there is some level of truth in that given the reality of how democracies operate, there's some kind of democratic mentality that you're more likely, on one level, maybe even work together because you see yourself as part of a project, but those people who want to be politicians may have to actually care about the views of their constituents, and not just because once every 4 or 5 years they're going to elect you, but you have to come up through that rank. I think that's potentially a way in which you get a little bit more influence, but it still doesn't necessarily seem to be a huge amount of influence. It certainly doesn't seem to be influence over the macro level policy, which sometimes affects our lives, but certainly not to claim that those micro policies, what happens on local level, doesn't matter, and those are areas where you certainly do have more influence. It's worth noting, though, that you even have notions of local democracy and states we don't consider to be democratic. In China, for instance, you do have competitions between different members of the Communist Party. Now, that might seem like it's not democratic at all, but they are still competing with each other on some of those local issues. So you don't necessarily, for those benefits, need a full-scale democracy. You just need some level of competition, sometimes on almost technocratic issues, how waste collection works, how certain levels of education policy work. So so there is certainly some value in that, but that doesn't really need what we consider to be a full democracy. So I guess one thing I want to tease out of this is justifying the merits of democracy on a way which isn't about producing results is pretty difficult. To the extent we have one, it is something about the importance of the people as a collective having some ability to make a decision or to influence decision-making overall, which almost just steps you back to another question, which is, why exactly should we be bound or believe there is value in what other people within our community think? Or why should we believe it is better that I'm subject to the wills of my community or the majority within my political community rather than a minority within the state? I think these are some very interesting questions, but I think the biggest takeaway from a debating perspective is more often than not, in debates about democracy, what both sides will be agreeing on is that democracy is good, but the justification they're going to have for it in many different ways is going to come out to, it will produce better results than whatever alternative you are suggesting. And obviously the alternatives I'm talking about aren't just a totally non-democratic system. They could be, let's talk about different kinds of voting processes. PR versus first past the post. So i.e. one where you have constituents and you can win with a minority, with less than 50% of the overall population. Well, if we care about a democratic principle where everyone should be worth the same, it's obvious a PR system is better. If we instead care about the outcome of a democracy, you can definitely argue one where you end up with a greater chance of having a single party in government may be better. Now, obviously you can make arguments on both of those, but the point is the debate then becomes about that practical question rather than the principal question about which one of these is, quote-unquote, more democratic or more principally legitimate. I think that is an important realization for most of these debates about democracy, that we do come down to that question. Which one is more likely to get positive results, and which kind of policy is less likely to get positive results? It becomes practical much more than a principal question. I think you should just be aware of that, and aware that most of the arguments you'll be making will probably be speaking to that issue. Any thoughts, any questions about anything else we'll say about the value of democracy?
I do have one. Do you classify treatment of opposition and any dissenting voices as a result or as a principled argument? So the likelihood of a democratic system producing a comparatively better outcome for those who do not agree with the state's policy, is that a result, or is that which part of the argument do you classify that in? I mean, I would say that empirically it should be more or less true. Give, I don't know, examples of places where being in opposition to what the government says, in places where the semblance of democracy is lesser, even if it's not a fully undemocratic system. I mean, beyond Singapore, which I also don't think actually does include the part where you don't want to participate. It's not like your life is as good as when you want to participate. Is there a place where non-participation in a non-democratic system means for you no bad consequences? And is that a principle or a resulting characteristic?
Well, so it's certainly a resulting characteristic, as in the fact that you would suggest that in general democracies will have this outcome, that even those who are members of the opposition or do not agree with government policy will not see their quality of life negatively affected, is actually, I think, a statement of the kinds of institutions which you have around a democracy. Will there be autocratic systems where that's the case? it depends on how vocal you decide to voice your opposition, which is if you decide to not voice it in a particularly vocal way, in most systems you'll probably be okay. I think the reality, though, is even in most democratic systems, if you have a strong opposition towards the line of the government or ideology in power, you're probably still going to have your life negatively affected. Not necessarily fully, because there are certainly going to be bubbles of different kind of dissenting opinion, but it will probably still be an impact. I think the basic claim there is that definitely seems to be an outcome to me, which is democracies are more tolerant towards opposition movements rather than that creating some principled justification for it. I think that's an empirical regularity rather than a principled justification for it, because this leads to a certain positive outcome rather than irrespective of the outcome, this is a good thing.
If somebody said it's about freedom of expression or freedom of choice to believe in certain things, then how is that not a principled argument? In that, if there is a limitation on your ability to have an opinion, I mean, sure, the expression of that opinion is the part that is actually actively harmed, rather than the possibility of having one. I mean, whatever, Soviet Russia would still have you can still believe in whatever you want to believe in any autocratic system, but if the belief is not connected to a resulting, if the belief cannot result in any type of action, or cannot result in an action that in any way would be possible to be conferred to another individual, so you cannot share your belief, simply, then how is that not a principled defense of the democratic system as opposed to an outcome-based one? I mean, if it is a defense of democracy is based on the idea of choice or, freedom of belief and things like this.
Because underlying that claim, and I guess this steps onto a second question, which is when we care about democracy and we believe it is valuable, we don't simply mean that people are able to use the word democracy. We believe that there are certain kinds of prerequisites necessary for us to call a system democratic. And I think it's worth interrogating those. So one of those might be the free media or free speech. But if you think about it, it is certainly plausible we can live in a system where you can say whatever you want, but no one is able to hear you, and you don't have the means of amplifying your voice. Is that enough for you to have free speech? Or to put it differently, when we think about free speech, the ability to challenge your government, to present different ideas, we don't just mean that you can say what you want without people persecuting you, because that doesn't seem to make it democratic in and of itself. People, for instance, talk about in Iran, the lipstick revolution against the status quo is that women are still able in many small ways to challenge the government. They're just not able to do so in a way which is particularly effective in the public realm. You can definitely do so on a minor person-to-person level by simply not doing what the religious theocratic establishment wants you to do. So it seems to be more than just democracy allows people to express themselves. There seems to be an institutional question underlying this, which is what do we need for a democracy to exist? And it seems to be more than just this baseline of not being persecuted if you have a certain level, a certain opinion. So what kind of prerequisites do people believe need to exist for democracy to function? Some of these should be fairly trivial ones, but yeah.
Plural parties, like.
Okay, so almost trivially, you need multiple different parties. But let's push this further. We certainly probably wouldn't call a system democratic if you had one political party, which was the only party you could vote for. Trivial. How about if you had two political parties which exposed more or less the exact same idea, some minor differences? And often this is what happens. You end up with lots of political parties moving towards the centre, with the same kinds of economic policies. Yes, there are going to be differences, whether you tax at 40% or 42%, but certainly, is that a democratic system where you have options, there are differences, but those differences are minor?
It's not about the number, it's about the possibility of establishing a party and voting for every single party that exists.
Okay, so So your claim, so it's not just about having multiple parties or one party. That seems to definitely be the case. So instead, it might be that there aren't significant enough barriers to entry for you to challenge the dominant political parties and dominant ideas in place. But that is an incredibly demanding claim, which is, it is, to put it very simply, one which would may deny, depending on the way you think about it, the United States as a democratic system, which is, can you really challenge the control of these two political parties? Yes, you can theoretically form another party, but again, the difficulty of resources, of media coverage, that seems to be perhaps ideally true, but is one which is incredibly demanding as a concept of democracy. So, yeah.
But there are many proofs, like if you can actually say that the United States are not fully democratic, and do it very easily.
You can definitely come to that conclusion, but I guess the question then is, which countries are democratic, and at some point do we then have a fairly pointless justification as to, there's these three countries which meet our criterion for democracy, everything else is some form of quasi-democratic, oligarchical, or authoritarian state. Maybe that is correct, but this almost becomes a semantic question, and I would just suggest that if we end up with the conclusion that large parts of Western Europe and North America aren't democratic, we've probably created an idea of what a democracy is, which is probably no longer a particularly valuable one, as it no longer describes a reasonable number of countries. But maybe if you just exclude the United States, that's going to be different. But how else can we think about it? So certainly we want there to be the possibility of new ideas emerging. There have to be some barriers. It's unrealistic to suggest that you can easily express those new ideas. But how would you want to encapsulate then, given these two extremes? You can't simply have two parties which say have the same ideology. It's probably unreasonable or unlikely that you can have a million different ideas, all of which have the possibility of getting significant airtime or challenging the dominant political hegemony. At what point are you no longer democratic, and at what point are you democratic?
I mean, it's all about the number of percentage of people who actually care about this idea.
Yeah.
So if I start my party and I don't know, it's for banning all the chairs because I hate chairs.
Yeah.
Then it's pretty normal that I don't have any support in terms of. I will get a lot of media coverage. That's true. But in terms of financing, probably not a lot. But if we are talking about the problem of a couple of percentages of the population, then that should mean that they should get some financing. I mean, in Poland, if you get like 3% in the general vote in the elections, you get a lot of financing.
Yeah.
So basically, if it's important for at least 2-3% of the population, maybe we should care about it.
Okay, so to phrase that differently, there's a political space, which is live political issues which people care about, and different opinions which could, theoretically at least, attract a reasonable proportion of the population need to be able to be expressed. That, I think, is certainly a very valid way of thinking about it, but it is more complicated than it seems, if for no other reason than certain opinions may be very attractive to the population, but are only attractive to the population once they're aired, which is, it's not like people know that they care about this kind of economic policy of another until someone is explaining that this is the way to solve your problems. It can then become important in the political space, but isn't necessarily before that point, before the views are expressed, considered to be important to a large group of the population. And I think the reason this distinction matters is, a priori, I couldn't then say a system is democratic or not. Some views are not going to be expressed. They can't get a political party to back them. But I don't know whether those would be attractive or not until they are going to be aired. And they can't just be aired in a corner of the internet, because that's where you don't get the kind of space to convince other people. And so I think in a theoretical world, it's a very interesting and probably correct way of thinking about what opinions need to be expressed and you need to be able to support but probably not very useful if we're going to look at a system and say, is that democratic? Well, we'll struggle a little bit more to use that as the criterion.
So basically, in this case, if you have two parties, right,
Mhm.
and suddenly you don't consent to neither party's views, obviously you're not going to support neither party,
Yeah.
which means you're going to look for alternatives, which means you will find that party which is newly established and is not, and well, has different views from the two current which are dominant.
Mhm.
So the undemocratic process would be when many people would understand that the two ruling parties are not supporting the views of the majority of the people, yet the majority cannot provide their consent to the new party, which is not the dominant one right now, but would like to enter the political arena.
So let's disaggregate this, which is multiple countries, you have 2 or 2.5 political parties. Why are they likely, or why would you argue, and we can obviously talk about this empirically, but just on a level of logic, why often do they express the same kinds of political opinions?
Because the majority of people agree to them. I mean, right now, most of the parties are run like good corporations. They understand their target group, they understand their marketing, their PR, they just understand what the majority of people care about. And the idea is that the majority of people don't really care about much. They just want to feel a little bit justice, they want to feel good in terms of economy, and until you hit them really hard and start to discriminate them, they aren't going to do anything.
Yeah, we'll come back to that other bit of it, but the core claim here is to maximize your votes as a certain kind of position you're more likely to be in, somewhere, I guess, definitionally central, that is advantageous for multiple parties, or both parties to try and claim that centre. If you're a slightly right-wing party, and if you think of a very simple right-left scale, you'll win the right and bits of the centre. If you're a left-wing party, you'll win the left and a bit of the centre. So suddenly then there becomes an incentive to move more and more towards the centre. So that's one. Naturally, there is incentives to move towards the centre, as particularly with two parties. The winning party, in general, is the one who captures the median voter, i.e. the voter right in the middle. Why else might you end up with a tendency towards a similar ideology or similar set of policies dominating in a political system, particularly one with 2.5 parties? Yeah.
Because you don't always get to rule on your own, so you need to rely on forming coalitions. Coalitions are based on negotiations and forming compromises, and these compromises can only be, they need to be advocated to your own group of people in a way that, look, we didn't completely fulfill what you wanted us to do, but we did it quite, and in order to make it appealing, you kind of have to adapt your own ideology so that it fits what you actually did for the voter. I guess it's a slow and more subliminal process.
So, in order to make sure you have a political party which can get into positions of government, in some systems, indeed in the majority of democratic systems, you need to be able to form coalitions. Inherent within that is the idea of flexibility to your ideology, or some kind of meta set of claims which everyone agrees with. And that prevents people going too far on either side, because doing so will make them unappealing coalition partners, and thus for most parties making them unlikely to do that, given they care, even not only but primarily, about getting into government. But yeah.
I think I remember saying that there's a case of the two parties that no one supports, but in a truly democratic system that wouldn't really vote, because it wouldn't really work, because there is a popular kind of demonstration that you just don't go voting if you don't like or you put an empty ballot. So that is easily put, that the idea that there can be two parties that don't support anyone's beliefs.
Can I
So we'll come back to that, because that's true, but I think speaks in a slightly different direction. But go ahead, yeah.
but looking based on Poland,
Yeah.
on the politician scale, for the last 8 or 12 years, the majority of, let's assume that half of the people went to vote, and that's pretty optimistic. So the other half is, you called it demonstrating, but we just assume that they don't care and they're just too stupid, or they just don't care. So we don't really see it as a demonstration of people not having any choice. And also the majority of people are voting against the party or a person, not in favor of their ideas. So
let's come back to that.
It's easy to find something that you hate and just vote against it, even if you can't vote for something.
Yeah, we'll come back to that, because I think that's an important claim about how people vote, what that leads to. But I think, just to step back for one moment, what I think we've suggested is, often when you end up with a small number of parties, there are reasons why they end up expressing a small number of views, more centrist views, however that's defined within a particular polity, rather than a spectrum of views. And that in itself may well be, quote-unquote, undemocratic, because there are going to be lots of views which may well be popular, which will not be expressed through the democratic system. While it is probably the case that these views, which are non-centrist, are unlikely to win an election, it is worth noting who the median voter is, i.e., what voter you need to capture to win an election is not static. It will change. It will change as different opinions are going to be expressed. It will change as different circumstances occur over time. So it could well be the case that ideas which could attract a majority of the population or a sufficient group to impact policy within that state are not going to be, or not currently expressed. So the conclusion we've reached is, for a system to actually be reasonably democratic, those kinds of opinions need to have some kind of outlay, which need to be plausible, either to express them through the formation of a new political party, or more likely, and more often the case, through the existing political party. And I think that's also important, which is political parties are not in and of themselves static entities. They are ones which move in terms of what kind of opinions they represent. And that can be another way in which you get something closer to an ideal democracy, which is, to take the extreme example of the United States, which is the party you see now of Donald Trump is suddenly very different than the Republican parties of years gone by. Look, for instance, on views of free trade, often the staple of the mainstream Republicans to support free trade, to support deregulation of the financial system, all seem to be things which, at least in the Trump rhetoric, are things he moves against. And that's now what the party represents. It's probably even what the majority of the population supports over notions of free trade. And while you didn't see the emergence of a new party per se, those kinds of opinions could be catered to within the existing political structure, which means even though you had a two-party system, even though it's near impossible, maybe not entirely impossible, or highly improbable that a third party could emerge, you can still have some level of change, imperfect as it may be, accepted and expressed through the existing system. So I think there's just some of the ways of thinking about what you need for a democracy. And I think this can be important. So in the UK, we sometimes have debates, or have had debates, about whether the rise of the left of the Labour Party and people like Jeremy Corbyn is good for democracy or not. And I think one of the arguments you would raise is the alternative of the new Labour conservative governments which existed from 1997 to 2014 were all very centrist. So you didn't have an expression or even potential outlay for other people with different kinds of opinions. And maybe that's something which you need if you are really going to have a democratic system. But I think these are just some ideas to think about what we need for a democracy. So political parties, you need more than one, obviously, but part of it is that there's also some level of either potential or actual ideological differences between those parties and actual differences within the political platforms. What else? What other kinds of conditions are necessary for democracies to exist?
I mean, we should at least try to create a notion that the people in this country are more or less even.
Okay.
So we don't discriminate them based on their looks, based on their choices in terms of the parties, based on their job. I mean, it doesn't really work in any democracy, I know, but the majority of people should discriminate the less they can.
Okay, so necessary for a notion of democracy is some kind of concept of equality. But this is incredibly, but it's a vague concept at this point, and I mean naturally so, which is, what level of equality do you mean? Do we mean material equality? Do we mean that we just think of everyone starting from a vaguely equal position, that we shouldn't discriminate on them per se based on their race, gender, sexuality, or anything like that? And those are obviously very important questions, but step back for a moment, why does equality matter?
Because in the democracy or generally?
Yeah, for democratic government.
Because there is this idea that there is this idea that we should all start from an equal point, and everyone should get a more or less fair chance. Also, it doesn't work with the economy.
Right. So. I agree with you,
but it's a hard question to answer in one sentence.
Yeah, so I agree with you, and this is part of the difficulty, which is the answer you're effectively giving is equality matters because it matters for democracy. But I guess, again, the question is, and I think there's one thing about principles in debates or in general, which is the only way in which you can justify them is trying to appeal to one of those, a higher principle or another principle, and saying this matters because it's more likely we get that other principle. But let's come back to this. So equality in some ways important. I
actually wanted to add another feature.
Go ahead.
I think regular voting is necessary for a democracy, obviously, and probably independent jurisdictions.
What do you mean by independent jurisdictions?
Independent justice system.
Okay, so regular voting, definitely, almost trivially, but yeah, that's definitely, I think, important rather than just having a one-off election. But let's go to the second one, which is an independent judicial system.
Yeah.
Why is that important? I think that kind of links these ideas together.
I mean, I guess it goes back to checks and balances, so that those who are in power don't misuse the power that they have been entrusted by the people.
So this is interesting because there's two ways of thinking about it, right? Which is we care about an independent judiciary because we want to make sure that those in power do roughly what the people want.
Yeah. Basically,
definitely one.
This is like, in brief, it could be summarized as limits on the government. As it has to have limits.
Right. So
in terms of
to think this in an economic sense, we have a principal agent problem. We have a population who gives power to a small group of representatives, and a court ensures that those representatives cannot go too far away from the popular will through limits placed on them through constitutions, etc. However, phrased that way, your court system doesn't limit the population and the scope of the decisions they make. So we talk about John Stuart Mill, we talk about the tyranny of the majority. The way you've thought about courts here has nothing to do with that. The majority should still be able to do what they want, and it's only about limiting how far the MPs and the government moves away from the population. And potentially that is a notion of democracy, but is then a notion of democracy which cuts potentially against the notion of equality, because it can certainly be the case, and has been the case in a vast number of cases, where the majority simply want to limit and restrict legislatively or otherwise the rights of a minority, and sometimes court systems work to prevent it. The question is that democratic or necessary for democracy? Sometimes they don't. There's an interesting question of to what degree courts then, in that sense, are democratic. We'll come to that in a moment when we talk about equality, but yeah.
Trying to link these things, basically. I mean, we have the principle that everybody's equal when facing the law, and I think because we need an equalizer, we need to get rid of something that we would probably call social Darwinism. That means that just because I am in a stronger position from a, I don't know, natural resources point of view, for example, I don't get more rights necessarily than you. That also protects minority groups, for example, from being bullied out of certain positions or bullied out of their rights or their privileges by the majority, because the law shouldn't look at it from an absolute number, number, but from a from another principled point of view. That means if one group has the right to assemble, for example, then there needs to be significant evidence on, or like reasoning on why another group that is similar in its circumstances should not get this right.
Right. Okay, and I think all that's true. It's now still asking for the fundamental question of why do we believe in equality before the law? Why does that matter so much? Yeah, go ahead.
About the equality is important because equality doesn't hurt anything but could provide rights to everyone, and it isn't cost so much that we should. Is the reason why we should follow the equal rights?
Potentially, but the existence of inequality in whatever form you decide to mention it, racial inequality, gender inequality, often does have a logical basis for it. There are going to be individuals who are going to benefit as a result. Take an obvious example, racial discrimination, which means people of certain ethnicities or races cannot get certain jobs, is one which is going to help the majority group, which is you're almost certainly principally correct. That shouldn't outweigh the benefit of equality, but it certainly isn't the case that equality, in a straightforward way, benefits all individuals. Mass inequality will certainly have individuals and groups who are going to win. So I think the notion of equality and the value of equality isn't just going to be, or can't simply be, that equality is better for everyone or has no costs attached to it, because there are costs of equality, but we want to believe that they're worth it. Yeah.
One could argue with Rawls, who says that a state needs to be able to justify their actions to every member of the society, and most of the time those who are worst off need also, or the state also needs to be able to justify to those who needs to be worse off, which most of the time leads to them having to do actions that benefit them to that amount that it leads to more equality. But I mean, this is just another theory and not necessarily linked to democracy.
Yeah, so Rawls comes up with the conclusion we should care a bit about democratic governance. These are effectively his conclusions, that we need to care and include everyone. The difficulty for Rawlsian theory, this is parenthetical, I guess, to our major discussion, is he says there's a reflective equilibrium, that if we really think about it, this is all that makes sense. Great, but not very useful as a logical theory or even semi-logical theory we can employ in debates. But it sounds persuasive and intuitive, which sometimes is enough, but it just seems like we should be able to come up with something a little bit more. Yeah.
Well, if we're debating equality is good or bad, well, in democracy, I see it like we have got a voting system.
Yeah.
Like everyone should vote, or have the right to vote. So there are inequalities, so that the minorities, if they're oppressed, they don't have the full impact that reflects on voting and being voted on. So that if they don't have this impact, then the majority has even more votes. So that, undermines the whole idea of voting in just a democratical way.
Okay, maybe to just phrase this question a little bit differently. When we think of a democracy, we presumably believe a condition, never state this explicitly, but it seems so obvious, is that the franchise is fairly large, that people are able to vote even if they don't have income or a large amount of wealth, irrespective of their gender. to some degree, irrespective of age, assuming they meet some kind of cognitive standard. So you give a number 18, 21, 16 for that. So we are suggesting a notion of equality underpinning this. The question is, why is that the case? I could potentially come with a coherent argument which suggests that the best democratic systems would be the ones where a handful of individuals vote, maybe tens, hundreds of thousands, who are the most educated, who have degrees, who are able to get in, think of lots of his opinions. Some of them might even express other opinions because of liberal guilt or whatever. None of this has to be overly compelling, but I could definitely argue that you can end up with better decisions if you restrict the franchise and restrict the kinds of people making decisions. But we don't think of that as democratic because we believe there should be a reason why other opinions are going to be expressed. And maybe to start putting some of these ideas together, maybe the reason why we care about the notion of equality is that we should recognize that no individual or group of individuals knows what the best idea for that entire society is. And the notion of equality is the idea that there are going to be people with different life experiences and different positions who all have different notions as to what the best ideal way of organizing a society and policies you need are. And the notion of equality is just the ones that people should be able to express those views, gain potentially some traction for those views, and have the ability to, in some level, convince other people of the validity of those views. Without that, if you only have a small group perpetuating itself with the same ideas, you end up with a one- or two-party systems representing the same idea. So instead, equality is almost derivatively beneficial, because that means that you have more ideas, more plausible ideas as to what that best society is. Just as if we care about what the outcomes of democracy are, we do need to care about the fact that different ideas are expressed, different ideas can be voted on, and that does involve different members of society in different positions being able to express those kinds of ideas. That may explain, obviously not the entire reason we find equality to be valuable, but maybe from a democratic perspective, why equality is a precondition to having a functioning democratic system. Because we need different ideas. You can't vote on an ideal system without the presentation of those ideas. So maybe that's part of the justification for it. But you had a comment.
Yes, you said, for me, the lack of any kind of need to be voting is kind of fictitious because, in fact, the majority of people voting for a party is not the thing that matters the most, because anyway, most people don't care or don't know what they're voting for, and for me, democracy happens inside the party. So, for example, in DNC, that certain candidates are elected by the members of the party. So, for me, the most important thing in democracy is that individual parties are kind of flexible and are open to changes. Every member can have his opinion. So, for example, in USA, it kind of works because there are lots of member parties, Republican and Democratic, and those parties change themselves. So the democracy happens on a smaller scale, but for me, it's still democracy. Kind of. And for example, the ruling party here in Poland, I'm sorry if I offend anyone, is kind of ruled by one person. So it's exactly the opposite of what's in USA. So that's important in democracy for me, the party itself.
So I think there's two things. So I guess we're just interrogating what you believe about this, which is undoubtedly internal party democracy is important, particularly when you're going to have a limited number of political parties. That's most systems. But I guess you would also agree, in most countries, that's never going to be sufficient. So you can have internal party democracy within the Communist Party within China, but nonetheless, none of us would consider that to be democratic per se. So I think it's a potentially a necessary condition. It's certainly not a sufficient condition for democracy, but I do think that is an important realization that some of the benefits you can obtain from having multiple parties effectively can also take place through two parties with internal democracy. or to place it in a slightly hyperbolic but nonetheless partially accurate way, if you think about all the democracies which have runoffs, so you have a first round with multiple parties and then 2 candidates in a second round, it's not a terrible model for even what you see in many two-party systems, which you have the party members deciding between different kinds of ideologies, and this comes out as 2 final outcomes which are decided by the majority of the population. Now, obviously that's imperfect because there's a subgroup of the overall population making that determination, but that certainly can be quite manageable, particularly given that the majority of most populations are politically apathetic. But I think all of this is good just in terms of thinking about what we need for a democracy, what is valuable and why it's valuable. Before we end this part of the discussion and talk about how people vote and what they vote for, do people have any more comments or thoughts about what we need for a democracy or why democracy might be valuable? Yeah.
Maybe I would like to add that in democracy we have some mechanism which protect the majority against the rules of one party or one person. I mean, we have the law which is posed by our representatives, which we are voting for, and this law is accepting for not only by the majority, but by all society, I think. And this law is important for which is provided by our representatives is important to state that in democracy.
Yeah, so I think this is definitely true. I think it almost moves to a different kind of idea, which is how do you create a stable democracy? But I think there is certainly something in that. People have to buy into ideas. These ideas have to be about protecting people. And one thing which I think is worth noting, albeit the slightly side issue, is during the 1990s, or late 1980s and 1990s, you would have people like the then Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir, talking about how democracy, like human rights, are a first world affectation, i.e. something which is applicable in some circumstances but not others, and ones which is incredibly Western in the way it operates. I think it's almost just worth... What that means is that what most people experience when they first get a democracy is something mechanical, which is you walk into a polling station, you tick a box. Is that really something which we care a great deal about? Sometimes when you have a new democracy, the answer is yes. But the reason you care about that is because the kinds of narratives, stories, and histories about what democracy is. But more often than not, in those early years, democracy isn't very stable because there isn't a great deal of loyalty towards this institution, which hasn't provided any concrete benefits to you. So part of the importance of democracy and its stability is making it seem like something which people care about, which people buy into, which people find to be valuable, and that's something which is going to be done over time, and isn't a very simple thing to do, and is certainly a very contestable notion, which has been contested across the world, and to some degree still continues to be contested in some very notable cases. Any other comments before we ask the question, what do people vote on? Okay, so then let's ask this question. How do people decide who they are going to vote for? And there obviously isn't one answer to this. People decide things in multiple different ways, but let's try and homogenize a large amount of the population. What would we suggest that they care about? Yeah.
I would start with saying that they mostly care about people, not really ideas, not really parties, but people. I mean, we've seen it with Trump, for example.
Mm-hmm.
They were voting mostly for him. They didn't really understand what does he stand for, because he didn't have really an agenda for most of his run, but they still were for him as a person. So they, first of all, find a person that they like, that they find charismatic.
Mm-hmm.
Then they cross out the people that they dislike.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the times you're left with one party.
Okay. So for lots of people, their vote is going to be personality driven. That's interesting, and certainly I think has some validity to it. But there are, of course, other questions behind it. What kind of personality traits they find to be appealing? Is it really as simple as they like the person or will accept any policy? I think there's probably a little bit more to it than that, but we'll come back to it. Because obviously I don't think you take the most extreme version of that, but let's come back to that one. Yeah.
Which of us?
You first, yeah.
Okay, so I do think that the decisions are made mostly based on emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So we all kind of read opinionated news all the time, and we aggregate our emotional stance towards some candidates. And it's also kind of not only how the candidate is similar to us in those opinions, but also the PR, his kind of public impression he makes, and we kind of try to justify it by logical conclusions such as this agenda. But the decision, for me at least, is mostly made based on emotions still.
Okay. Let's go over there. Yep.
As for me, the starting point for deciding whom I want to choose is answer for the question what my life is and what I want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then if anyone says anything that it could make your life better, it could persuade you, because the real meaning of policy is changing life, because it's all what we created and the world we want to live. So if there's any idea whom I think that may change something in my life, it's the most important factor to think if I want to vote for this person, because then I'm voting for the idea.
Okay, so positive or negative future change being an important way of thinking about policy. Over there? Yep.
Maybe people will vote on the men who will fulfill their needs and expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at Trump, he will make America great again, because America is weaker and weaker.
Okay. Yeah, so it is, whether people know it or not, there are certain kinds of ideas which can be articulated very well, even if they are at core incredibly vague, which can be appealing because it hits to a nerve, something you care about. In a sense, it's emotional, but a nice phrase. What you find to be emotionally important can almost suddenly be impacted by the way those ideas are presented. Let's take a couple more opinions. Yeah.
So, I'll basically build up on that. I think the key idea is policies. Now, when people vote, I make the assumption that people are rational. That means they actually look at when I mean rational, I mean that the preferences of those peoples are transitive and complete. That means they look at all of the possible opinions and possible policies, and then they weigh which one they like the most. And then obviously every person has a different opinion what they like the most. Some people who voted for Trump really mattered about international policy and migration, so they didn't want any refugees, and they put international policy as their first thing, so they voted for Trump because he was strictly against, for example, refugees. Then other people cared more about internal policies or healthcare. So basically they vote for the political party which offers the best alternative for them in terms of policy, in terms of that particular policy which they like the most.
Okay, let's cut. We'll cut this at this point to just discuss these ideas, and we'll come back to a few others. So, in a sense, there are two very different ideas of what people are voting on, and these ideas are the rational, which is policy, and different people will care about different kinds of policies, different issue dimensions will be determinative of what people vote for. That's one of them. The other one is the notion of emotion. Who do you like emotionally? What do you think they'll do for you? Then we have claims as to how do you evaluate these? Do you evaluate policy in terms of whether or not you look in the future and say, is this going to improve my life? Or as someone I think brought up earlier, you often vote against an idea. Ronald Reagan said in 1980, 1984, the question is your life better now than it was 4 years ago? Well, that isn't presenting a positive vision. It's a question as to, this is a referendum on the previous government. And I think there's obviously a multiplicity of different ways in which people determine their votes. If your voting preferences and what determines your vote isn't rational, we're kind of stuck. But if the fact there is an industry around it, so many people talk about what determines votes, we do post-election analyses of what people are deciding on, there's at least probably some element of rationality within it. Now, this may be faux rationality, maybe, as suggested, we have an emotional response, we make that decision, and then we rationalize it ex post rather than use rationality to decide who we think we should vote for. But there's definitely some notion of rationality. So if we're going to think about this from a more structured perspective, let's assume, which is probably the case, that a reasonable amount of the population won't vote. Let's say at least 30%, up to 50%, sometimes more. Of those individuals who do vote, there are going to be individuals who are captured, who will vote almost irrespective for one party or another party. There is going to be some movement there. Some of them might otherwise decide to stay at home. Some of them might move to a new party in some cases. But as a simplification, let's just assume that they're not going to be the important category of people when it comes to determining election. So we're now talking about this group in the middle, maybe 10, maybe 20% of the population, which is going to determine who is going to win an election. So how are those individuals going to be voting? Now, bear in mind those individuals can change. Over time, they're definitely going to change. They're going to change geographically as to who they are. It's going to change in terms of democratic ideas in terms of who and what ideas they find to be appealing. But this is the group we're talking about, the people within the middle who have flexible ideologies, who are floating voters, probably with some level of preferences. So let's first talk about those individuals who are going to care about policy. What policies are they going to care about? Are they going to care about every policy? Yep.
I think they're going to care about the policies that would affect them personally, but also ones that affect groups that they care about.
Right.
So, well, maybe the policy is about their children, or if it's about their work, or if it's about their parents.
Yeah.
Or they, people vote when they feel it's personal for them.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise they don't see the reason to vote.
Okay, so there is certainly going to be, I wouldn't say everyone, but probably the majority of people will vote based on the notion of personal interest, or sometimes a more extended version of that, which is you certainly see middle-class individuals voting for centre-left parties, partly because it also fits with their notions of ideology, sometimes fits with the notion of the extended South, other members of their community and their family in general. But I think one thing worth taking from that is what government does covers a huge range of different potential areas. But not all of them are going to be determinative of your vote. If I see a political party which I think has an economic platform which fits with my self-interest, or maybe what I believe ideologically is correct, I'm probably more likely to vote for them, even if their notions of foreign policy or their notions of gun policy are radically different from what I would have, which is it is unlikely that any single political party, particularly with a limited number of political parties, will directly map onto our preferences. And there's probably going to be a bit of each party's platform which you agree with. The question is, of all of those issues, which ones are the most determinative of your vote, and which of those policies and which party best meets those? And often the simplification, albeit not always the case, is what matters the most to people, is what affects their economic well-being. So a small subset of policies, often economic, will determine the way in which people vote. But what does that imply? And I think it's worth noting that probably implies that a lot of power for special interests. This is something which lots of people talk about, which is if your vote is going to be determined by a handful of major issues, and you don't really and maybe you care, but you're not going to change your vote based on smaller issues. Well, if you're a politician who wants to get re-elected, tailor those smaller issues to those individuals who will determine their vote on those smaller issues. So, in the United States, the majority may well want stronger gun control. Indeed, while people still want the access to guns, most opinion polls suggest that they are definitely much more prone to gun control than what dominant legislation is. However, there is a non-trivial minority of people who care most about having their right to guns being preserved. In which case, bearing in mind the majority will not be voting on it, but the minority will, have the economic policies the majority want, and have the gun policies the minority want, and the majority oppose, knowing it is likely to be on net positive for your chances of re-election. And that's just one example to just realize that a consequence of the way in which people vote, which is going to be a subset of all issues, is one where policy will often be determined in smaller areas to be beneficial to a smaller group. People can claim the same things happen with financial regulation, which is one of the reasons you saw financial liberalization. Isn't that something that the majority wanted? It was instead something which was incredibly beneficial to a small subset of influential individuals and influential institutions, and thus they determined, at least in the 90s and early 2000s, policies which led to far more financial deregulation than were perhaps supported by the majority. So this is how a democratic system can still end up with important policies being determined by small minorities, irrespective of the popular will. All of that comes back from the fact that people make decisions based on a small subset of issues rather than every single potential issue. Yeah.
Well, here I think that it was kind of assumed that there is a large number of swing voters who do not have clear stakes, for example, on the guns.
Yeah.
And I believe there is another issue that the most important issue is the number of voters of one party which go and vote, because there are not really many people who would change their opinion on guns in 1 year or something. There has to happen something really big and something really influential in their lives to change such fundamental issues. And I do think that people would vote for that the most important thing for a party is to present the other alternative as so devastating that they have to go to voting. That the most important thing is to present to the fixed voters that they really need to vote.
Right, so I think that's true. But let's use that same analysis to think about the way in which you win the swing voters. So obviously you need to make sure your base comes out and votes. Part of that will be by explaining why this election matters so much, why the alternative is so terrible, why if you don't vote, the consequences are you're not going to get any policy in your way. I think that's certainly part of it. But let's say you're a voter who cares the absolute most about your economic well-being. But what does that actually mean? It means that you care about your living standard, but that doesn't determine in any way who you're going to vote for. It's not like one party in most systems clearly is going to be standing for you are going to do less well under our government than you otherwise would. The question is certainly much more complicated than that. It's, I care about my economic well-being. This is what's going to determine my vote. And here are two policy platforms. As someone who doesn't fully understand the intricacies of these different policies, which one do I think is more likely to present positive outcomes for me? And I think there's there are three things which this probably leads to. One, most people will not be able to give you a full justification as to whether free trade has improved or harmed their standards of living. But many people have beliefs on this. And this might sound trivial, but if I ask most people in this room whether they believe in evolution, most people will probably say yes. If I was a strong creationist and could then start asking you questions about all the problems with evolution, most of you probably couldn't answer the tougher questions I ask. Darwin had problems explaining the evolution of the eye, for instance. And to some degree, even science is something which is not a statement of fact. The fact we believe in evolution isn't actually a factual claim we're making. It's not that we know this to be true because we can't fully justify it. It's almost a statement of identity. It's that we believe this to be true, and when you don't believe this to be true, you're unreasonable. And even when you know more and you can out-argue us on this, we still believe ourselves to be correct. And that's a very trivial example, but I think it's an important insight that many of the claims we're making, scientific, factual, economic, are not going to be claims based on analysis, but a claim's going to be based on identity. And even when you're in a room of very intelligent people with degrees or studying for degrees, we run into that same problem at some level. And I think when we think about the way in which people make decisions as to whom to vote for, they get different policies, the question is almost certainly interpretive, which is, you may believe free trade is good, you may believe it is bad. The question is, why do you choose one interpretation over the other? And some of those reasons are going to be, it's better communicated. Some of them are going to be, it's emotional, that you trust the person presenting it more than anyone else. But there are certainly going to be reasons. And it isn't simple enough to say, lots of voters dislike free trade, and as a result, they're likely in the Rust Belt to have voted for Donald Trump. Sure, but why do they believe that is the policy which is going to improve their standard of living? There's something about the context they're in, the social groups they're in, the media, what candidates are telling them, which is going to mean that I care about my economic well-being, and this is the policy I believe is going to improve the way I think I will do. And that, I think, is important worth keeping in mind. It's not going to be, I prefer policy X than Y. It's that I believe this policy will lead to the outcome I want, while your policies will not. Now, obviously, there are sometimes elections which are determined on wide ideological questions as well. So while most of what I've been talking about is about the post-political, the non-ideological elections, which I think have become more dominant within the Western world, there are certainly those which are also ideological, where big ideas dominate. And those are also going to be determined sometimes using rational calculuses, sometimes determined using emotional responses. But the other thing to note is, often given just how difficult these assessments about the future are to make, or the degree to which making assessments about the future are things which you can be incredibly uncertain about as a voter. That's often why you do end up with a referendum on the last 4 or 5 years as to are things going well? Well, it's because you don't really know what's going to happen in the future. So the best indicator you have is what's happened in the past. If the party's done well, great, I'll vote for them again. If they've done badly, I probably won't. Obviously, these are all different kinds of inputs which go into a decision-making process at once, and because of that level of complexity, we look for very simple heuristics, simple experiences we've had which can make decisions better or make decisions worse. But I do think, for the majority of swing voters, there is a thought process underpinning it. But often it's going to be short-circuited by the fact that I don't really know what's better, but it's what do we have in the information available which can convince us this is going to be better than what's happened before. And sure, some of the factors which your people will probably end up looking at will be gendered, they'll be racial, they'll be based on characterizations which are limited in terms of the way people look in photos or their personality. But I think underpinning all of that is we probably do care about policy, we do care about how things will be in the future, but there is a great deal of uncertainty over it. And that matters. And it's the ability to start working on those levels, trying to create an interpretation as to why you're doing less well, or why you will be doing much better, which is often what's going to really determine how people are going to vote. I think these kinds of insights us to think about things about interpretations, think about voting like many other decisions about identity more than about rational policy, can be very powerful in debate just to disaggregate what other teams are doing. Questions, comments, or thoughts? Yeah. Oh, okay. We're running out of time, but anyone have any last thoughts or questions or things to say? Great, then it's 5:30, so I guess we just drink.